it's just a constant churn of crisis and trauma that staff are facing and people in prison are facing every day, that their ambition is about just getting through the day.
So what was it like for you running prisons when you think most of the people in there shouldn't be in there?
Really hard, really hard.
My guest this week joined the prison service as a psychologist. She ended up running prisons as a governor and was director of women, in charge of all women prisoners. But she has now left and is the chief executive of the Prison Reform Trust charity. Pia Sinha, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How would you change the world?
So it's a massive question, and I always sort of slightly worry about coming across too trite, but I shall try and be grounded in my response. So what it triggered for me, the question, was when we were practicing psychology. It was a particular type of therapy called solution-focused therapy. And what we did was that when a client was in the middle of a deep, sort of stuck crisis, we asked them what was called a miracle question. And the miracle question works in the way that you'd say, you went to bed at night, and while you were sleeping, a miracle happened. You wake up the next morning, you don't quite know that this miracle has happened. What will be the first things that tell you that something was different? So I kind of used that as a way of framing the response for me. And I guess what I would do, so the miracle would happen, and I would notice that people were reacting to things in a slightly different way. And what I would say is that they would be more centered into their wise mind. So what we have in the way that we think, another psychological theory, if you will, and forgive me for that, is that you have in the way that humans react is that you have an emotion brain and you have your rational brain. And if you imagine them as two intersecting circles, in between the sort of overlap of that Venn diagram, you have your wise mind. And it's a place where you are not thinking about things in an overly robotic way, but equally you're not right in the middle of your emotional state. And the bit in the middle, which is the balance, is the wise mind.
Is part of what the problem is with our approach to prison, that we're too emotional about it?
We're too emotional about it, or we're too kind of robotic about it, or we're not emotional enough. And somewhere in the middle, you have your wise mind, which is a place where you have the balance right. And I think that the question about how I would change the world is I would say that we would, as a group of individuals, have the ability to channel and fast track our way into our wise mind when we were thinking about the problems that we face, so that we're making compassionate and evidence-based decisions, but that have emotion in them, but they're not overly swayed by the emotional content of what we're dealing with.
So what's wrong with the way we approach prison at the moment?
I think the what's happening right now is that we are seeing a reluctance to really engage in what the evidence is telling us and what the wisdom of that evidence is telling us. And we are drawn to knee-jerk reactions, and that is what's driving the agenda. And I think that when you are looking after some of the most challenging and difficult and damaged people in this world, you need to take a step back from the rhetoric and really look at what works and how we need to approach the tricky and the wicked problems without sort of entering into a sort of maelstrom of emotions about it.
And what is the biggest example of where we are not following the evidence?
So I guess the topical issue is what's happening currently around the Sentencing Council's guidelines. I think that what's occurred is that we've fixated on an incorrect and a misinterpreted version of what those guidelines are trying to enact or recommend. They're simply recommending that we need to ask for a pre-sentence report, ask for more information about an individual's history, what may have driven them to offending. It's a perfectly valid, legitimate question to ask when you're about to sentence someone.
And this is not just about the colour of your skin.
It's
about
not just the colour of
socioeconomics,
Correct.
Gender,
Correct.
Everything.
It's about everything. It's good practice. And it's not trying to influence the judiciary towards deciding what to do and how to sentence someone. It's just giving them all the information that they might find relevant before making that decision. And that's all that the recommendations are asking for. But what's happened, which is us being in emotion mind, if you take that theory forward, is that we've fixated on the wrong thing. We've fixated on the fact that we're going to have a two-tier justice system, for example, which means that some individuals get a bit of a touch. And that's not true. That's actually factually inaccurate. All we're saying is that it's good practice for the judiciary to have all the information that they could possibly need so that they come to the right conclusion about how someone needs to be dealt with or sentenced, etc. But because this rhetoric has now become so charged, action is being taken in a way that is a misinterpretation of the intention. And that's where we are going wrong.
I mean, what people on the other side of this say is that we already have a two-tier or a multi-tiered criminal justice system which discriminates against people from minorities, from the policing of crime right through to sentencing. Do you believe that's true as someone who's been in the system?
Well, absolutely. And I think that what's ironic about this is that we have had reports. The Lamy report, for example, has widely been accepted by this government, by the previous government, and it has acknowledged that there is inherent biases in the criminal justice system which need to be corrected. We also have the Equalities Act. They're all basically trying to say that, the way you deal with difference is not by trying to treat everyone the same. It's by having a nuanced approach towards it. So I find it slightly baffling that we're in this place where, despite all of the evidence that we have accepted, we're in that place where we're focusing on an argument that's slightly wrong-headed.
I mean, is it simply because politics is now driven by social media, which is in turn determined by emotional responses to things?
I'm afraid so. Yeah, I think that this is what feels slightly dangerous and slightly risky, because you're being led into alleyways that are meaningless, while the real social problems, the really challenging problems, then become completely ignored. It becomes a distraction. It becomes a noise in the system. And while our attentions are captivated by the titillation of that noise, we're actually ignoring the real things that we can do to make a difference.
There is a wider review going on at the moment about sentencing by David Gauke, former Conservative cabinet minister. And when that was announced, it was widely thought that this would lead to a massive reduction in the number of people going to prison. Do you think that's what we need?
Yes, absolutely. I think that when the review was announced, we were cock-a-hoop. We were excited. Our sector was really excited about it. And we remain optimistic. We want to see what the outcomes of this review are. We have to. Actually, in fact, we're in a place where the review almost becomes really urgent and necessary, because it's what's seen as the answer to trying to reduce the prison population. So the capacity crisis in prison is what's driven the commission of the sentencing review at some level. That's what's driving it.
That's also wrong as well, isn't it? The fact that it's being driven by resources and numbers rather than what's the right thing to do is also problematic.
It's problematic, but in some ways it's still welcome. Sometimes you need a crisis to kind of create the opportunity for some sensible reform to take place. And the sentencing review is probably been driven by the crisis, but actually was needed anyway.
And why do you think fewer people need to go to prison, having run one?
Having run one, I would say that my experience would suggest that there are quite a proportion of people that really shouldn't be in prison, for whom the solution towards reform and rehabilitation isn't prison. There are definitely people who do need to be in prison, but for a percentage of people who have drifted into prison because of problems that have occurred much earlier on in their lives, what they need is some support and rehabilitation and care at that earlier point, so that they didn't drift into custody in prison in the first place.
When you say they've drifted into prison, isn't that language a bit of a problem? They've broken the law. They've broken the codes and the rules of society.
Yes, I accept that. And that's a fair challenge. So the way I use the word drifted is probably that there have been some conditions that have happened, or there's some life events that have happened that have made those kind of crossroads quite difficult for people to navigate. So rather than choosing one path, they've chosen another. And actually, it isn't a caveat. It's not a catch-all. So there are people who've had really terrible poverty-stricken lives. They've had terrible childhoods, they've had trauma, and they haven't committed crimes and broken the law and ended in prison. And great, but there are others who haven't found their way out of those problems and crises, that they have probably gone into a life of drug dependency, they've gone into a life full of really poor relationships, and those kinds of life events have meant that they have come into contact with the criminal justice system. And those individuals, rather than put them in prison where they lose any anchors that they might have, they need to be supported sort of upstream.
So what proportion do you think of the prison population shouldn't be in there?
Well, I know that, you know, the numbers have been kind of thrown about.
Not just thrown about, but I mean, James Timpson, who's the minister now, who was your chairman, you know, famously said that he'd have let a third out.
Yeah.
They shouldn't, before he became a minister.
That's
he
right.
He came on this programme.
Yes, I know, yeah.
And said a third of them shouldn't be in there. And that virtually no women should be in prison.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know how he did the maths, and we've not done the maths on this, but he's probably right. I would say that, you know, when I started my career working in a women's prison, right, as a psychologist, and I would say, I would estimate that, you know, majority of the women that I saw, you know, who I did therapy with, I would say they shouldn't have been in prison. You know, because if they were supported and helped much earlier on, we would have prevented them from going down this route.
And why are women different to men? Well, you know, why is the proportion so different?
I think that, you know, actually they're not different from men. So what I would say, based on my experience of working psychologically with both men and women, the kinds of experiences that young girls and young boys have are exactly the same. How they manifest themselves in adolescence or older life in terms of the crimes that they might commit are quite different. But women tend to, their trauma stories lead them to certain paths which we need to acknowledge need different kind of support.
Like what? Give me an example.
Most of their offending, majority of women's offending is non-violent offending for a start, whereas men, sadly, they're more violent offending. So also a lot of women are in relationships where they are often coerced into offending. They also have the added difficulty of having children who they end up looking after. And when they do, there are other pressures and strains on them. And I think that requires a slightly different approach. So understanding the reasons why women commit crimes is really important to understanding what the solutions for them need to be. So that we need to have an approach that's a bit more kind of nuanced towards why someone is doing what they're doing and what would help them.
So what was it like for you running prisons when you think most of the people in there shouldn't be in there?
Really hard. But what you do, and this is the bit that I feel quite passionate about, is that even amongst all of this craziness that's happening in the world, the stuff we were talking about before, you still have to be the voice of reason and compassion and have hope, because unless there are people like yourself and the vast majority of practitioners who are actually there to do a good job, how do you actually try and, influence the system? So when you're there and you see that this is not right, or this is not fair, or this is not just, more importantly, you still have to go, well, how do I make a difference? How do I influence that? And the more senior you get in your career, the more influence you might have, the more impact you can have on the lives of those individuals.
So did you spend a lot of time as a prison governor thinking this is unjust?
I spent a lot of time as a prison governor being focused on what the outcomes for prisoners needed to be. Because what happens when you run prisons, you get quite quickly overwhelmed with the sort of managerial tasks of running a prison, and that takes you away from the central point of your existence. And the central point of your existence, is the way I saw it, was how do I make a difference to the lives of those individuals that are here to have potentially a reset while they're in prison, because I think that's the purpose of prison. The purpose of prison, yes, it is to punish, but it's equally about rehabilitation and allowing someone to have that second chance. And so when you are running a prison, you want to create an environment where that that idea thrives, that you're creating opportunities for people to thrive rather than decline. And the stories I hear from my ex-colleagues who are running prisons is that it is absolutely horrendous for them as people, as leaders who are trying to make sense of it and try to make it safe and decent and non-violent and prevent people from, killing themselves. I mean, it's literally that awful. And it's just a constant churn of crisis and trauma that staff are facing and people in prison are facing every day, that their ambition is about just getting through the day.
So forget about rehabilitation. Let's just get through the day without somebody killing themselves or somebody else.
Yeah, and those people, those leaders and those prison staff who manage to, despite all of that, run safe, ordered, predictable regimes need to be applauded in this current climate, because it's awful.
So when the government talks about these brand new prisons that are all marvellous and brilliant, are they?
I didn't visit HMP Mill site that opened last week, but my colleague did, and he said it was a very impressive facility. But, the true test comes when you fill it with people. But also, you've got to make sure that the staff are able to cope with that, and I think that that's the tricky bit. You can have a shiny new facility that has everything, but in the end, it's about human-to-human relationships and how equipped are staff to deal with that, because these are some of the most challenging people of our society.
And what is the reality about prison officers and who they are, why they go into it, and how good they are?
It's difficult because when you have people in prison that are very prison experienced, who've been in prisons through their lives, for example, and are older and savvy, and then you've got very inexperienced people working with them who've not really built up enough life experience. And I'm not being ageist. You'll get young people who are totally switched on and have the emotional intelligence and the right skills. But you do have others who've not really experienced anything that will prepare them for what that is going to be like. I think that combination and that clash, that meeting of those two things will be very, very challenging, very challenging. And so what you need to do as a leader, which is one of the things that you do have to focus on as a governor, not just what the outcomes of prisoners are, but also how you're looking after your staff, is what are you doing to look after their well-being? What are you looking at? What are you doing to their welfare? How are you training them? How are you equipping them with the right tools to be able to do this very, very complicated task? Prisons are a closed community. Prison officer's role, you're 1 minute you're a nurse, next minute you're a policeman, next minute you're a prison officer, next minute you're a social worker. It's a highly skilled job.
So it's pretty impossible to be in your wise head.
Correct.
As a prison officer, isn't it?
It's very, very difficult unless you are, really creating a culture that encourages wise mind. So you're encouraging a culture where staff are exposed to reflective practice, who understand about relational working, all of those things that give you that wisdom.
I mean, the trouble is that, the experience of this government is really instructive. When it first came in, appointed James Timpson as the prisons minister. There was this big sort of, wave of, oh, wow, there's going to be a new enlightened approach to prison and, we'll be sending fewer people to prison and, things are going to change. Then you get the riots. And there is this immediate demand to lock them up.
Yeah.
And some pretty tough sentences. And that kind of shows you the basic dilemma, doesn't it? That probably the same people who were arguing for a more enlightened approach to prison suddenly saw these race rioters who they loathe and say, yeah, lock them up.
Yeah, and that's the issue. If you're coming from a principled place, it has to be applied universally. You can't pick and choose what you like and what's consistent and what you don't like. So it's a wicked problem. It's a tricky thing to try and understand. And at that time, and for me especially, as a woman and as a woman of color, it triggered me, and it does trigger you. But that's the complexity of the job.
Did some of those sentences make you wince?
They didn't make me wince, but it did I really had to dig deep and try and find that sort of small kernel of empathy to try and understand what was driving some of the behavior, not to condone it, but to try and understand it. Because without that empathy, without that compassion, you do then join that brigade of lock them up and throw away the key. And it's so easy to do that. People in prison, depending on the things that they have done, they push your buttons. Because whatever position you want to take, they will push your buttons. So it's even more important that you're able to stand back from it. And that's part of your training. That's the part of the training that I think was most useful when I was training as a psychologist. You have to stand back. You have to suspend your judgment.
Now, given you say that the current crisis is really driven by numbers, is it the case that prison doesn't work? Or is it that prison on these resources can't work?
I think there are some people, as we said before, who do need to be in prison, who need that time away from the people that they have been hurting. But that's where the purpose of prison becomes really important. So if you say that whether prison works, prison will work if it's not overcrowded and beset by crises. When a prison is well led, when it's functioning well, when it has purpose, when it has interventions, when it has meaningful activity for people to engage with, then it does work. But in the current state, where literally all someone's getting is perhaps 45 minutes of fresh air a day, with no predictability, and you're spending the vast majority of your time in a tiny cell with another cellmate and a toilet, how can that do anything for you, for changing your mindset or rehabilitating you or helping you? And if that's the state, and that's the permanent state of prisons, then no, it doesn't work.
And so how do you feel now about what this government is likely to end up doing? I mean, do you still feel optimistic?
Well, Krishnan, I'm a ridiculously optimistic person by nature, and I feel that I have to be optimistic. Because otherwise, how else will you keep going on?
But the decision on the sentencing guidelines, which you began talking about, doesn't suggest that that's the direction of travel. It suggests that this government is sort of caving into social media pressure and the pressure from Reform and the Conservative Party and everything else, which is tough on law and order.
It's tough. It's been a tough week for us, for all of us, and we're waiting to see what happens. But I do think that, the sentencing review is imminent. I'm hoping that there's going to be some sensible recommendations in it that the government take up. The thing that...
But can you see in the current climate a government minister standing up and saying, you know what, we're not going to send people to prison anymore?
But I think they don't have a choice, because also what will drive some of this is that they do have to tackle the overcrowding crisis. Because if they do nothing, if they don't take any of the recommendations and in fact say that, we're fine, or we're going to be, our policies about sort of incarceration, you're going to end up with the same problem that you had last summer. So
more barges and
more
courts
courts saying that they can't send people to prison. I mean, it becomes, public safety grinds to a halt, because you're then having to say, don't arrest people, don't send people to court, don't send people to prison after they've been convicted, because this is what happens.
What do you think the failure then has been in terms of winning public opinion on the sentencing guidelines? Because ultimately... Robert Jenrick from the Tories has run a sort of very aggressive campaign around two-tier policing and two-tier justice. The government has essentially caved in and buckled to it.
So what's happened is that, and this is, they're focused on misinformation. The misinformation is that these guidelines are going to influence the sentence that people will get. It's not. The sentencing authority...
Well, what's the point of them then?
It's about it's called a pre-sentence report. A pre-sentence report is just good practice that gives the judge some information on the individual who's about to be sentenced. So it tells them what might have been the conditions that led to their offending, what might be some of their backstory.
But it will influence them then, won't it? It will influence the... Well, isn't that the point?
It's about informing them. Ultimately, it's about the decision. The independence of the judiciary still gets maintained. It's good practice for people to have as much information as possible when you're making a decision. I think that we would agree that as a universal truth, if you're making a decision, get as much information as you need and can have, because that will allow you to make a sensible decision. And that's all the guidelines. And they were guidelines, remember. They were just guidelines. They were saying that in certain cases, we recommend that you request a pre-sentence report. That's all the guidelines were saying. But because the bit that has been focused on is based on incorrect information, what it's done is that it's kind of rabble-roused towards the wrong thing. And because
so how do you stop that happening again when it's going to be a much bigger issue of the numbers of people you're sending to prison in the first place, and whether people should be sent to prison at all, let alone the guidelines that would govern it. It's going to be a much bigger row, isn't it?
It will be a bigger row, and you have to kind of roll your sleeves up and go for it.
So what should they do there that they didn't? Because this one has been a failure from your perspective. The other side have won.
Yeah.
So how are you going to win the next one, which is a bigger battle?
Well, we just have to keep chipping away at it. It's a difficult question to answer, but, what do PRT do? PRT's business is about informing the whoever is operating within the criminal justice sector about the facts and about the evidence. And what we need to do is move out of our echo chamber. We need to move out of the kind of converted into the areas where people don't necessarily know about the facts, and have faith in the belief that when people are armed with the facts and the evidence, that they do think slightly differently. And I think the thing that we need to do is enter that space a bit more. We need to start having conversations with the public through whichever means that feel important. And part of what I do when I do media, what my colleagues do, what others in the sector do, is that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to influence the debate towards becoming more sensible and wiser.
If you think back to your time as a governor then, I mean, you're not what most people would picture as a prison governor. On all sorts of levels, you're a woman from an ethnic minority, you're a psychologist by training, you're, not mild-mannered, but, a normal person.
Not a roughy-tufty big bloke.
How did people treat you?
I think that, I get asked that a lot. I think part of what happens when you go into prison work and the world of prison, it's less about what you look like and where you came from. It's about whether you have walked the walk, whether you've done the tough jobs, whether you've got credibility. What are you like as a human being? And those are the things that get you judged rather than, whether you fit the mold. And people will double take and people will ask you strange questions sometimes and all the rest of it, but actually the credibility that you get is through the work that you've done and your track record, as it were.
And how much did you interact with politicians
then
in that role? Yeah,
very little. So the first politician that I had any contact with was when I governed Liverpool, because it went so catastrophically wrong. It got all the media attention for the wrong reasons. I was probably the first prison governor that was invited to a select committee and had to give evidence. And at the time, Rory Stewart was the prisons minister, and he was very kind of hands-on and wanted to speak to the operational line. And so it was the first real contact I had. But other than that, or prior to that, very little.
What had gone wrong?
At Liverpool.
Yeah.
Practically everything. So I think that, there were some of the real challenges that are faced now that was being faced then. And at the time, it was a crumbling Victorian building that was falling apart. And it was, ironically, a capacity crisis. And what was being required of prisons up and down the country was to be filled up, and every space mattered. And you had poor regime. You had a crumbling building, you had frustrated prisoners, you had disenfranchised staff, and the whole thing was just, there was a sort of hardening of the view of what good looked like. So after a period, prisons very easily can deteriorate. So if you don't have someone who's there kind of saying, that's not right, and someone in a leadership position saying that's not right, they very comfortably default to just, being wrong. And I think over a period of time, what I described at Liverpool was that there was just a sense of learned helplessness. There was a sort of blindness to what was really going on. And it then got inspected, and it got caught with its pants down. But it was probably something that was happening up and down the country. And everything that was happening in Liverpool was driven by the fact that people stopped seeing that it was in such a mess. And so, from the state of the cells to the state of how staff and prisoners dealt with each other, from the governance that, looked at performance, it was all just misfiring on all angles, basically.
And what difference is it making now, having a prisons minister who comes from a prison reforming background in James Timpson, who had very strong views before he went into government about what should happen to prisons? He's not in charge of the sentencing review, but he's in charge of running prisons.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
So is he making any difference?
I think the biggest difference that it makes is that he knows prisons. He's been in prisons. He has been operating within prisons for decades, which is something that prison ministers who've been given the portfolio never have. So the first time a prison minister visits a prison is the first time they've ever entered a prison in their entire career. And so that fundamental difference is quite important because you get it. And I think what happens, you have the civil service machinery, you have the political machinery, all of which is going to try and influence you as a minister. And it's important then that as a minister, you know what you're talking about, you've seen it, you've walked the walk, so that when you see things or you hear things or you're being influenced about things that don't feel right, you can say, well, actually, that's not right. Because as a minister, you're very dependent on what you get briefed by, and you need to be critical of that sometimes. And I think that the good thing about James will be that he will know. He understands what good looks like. He has had several conversations with prison leaders. He's not someone who's just come in and done a high-profile visit. He actually goes, whenever I met him when I first was running prisons, and he just goes off and speaks to prisoners and speaks to staff. He won't have the red carpet treatment. So I think that he comes from a place, an informed place, and I think that's really important.
Is there any difference noticeable yet?
From my point of view, from being in the third sector, yes. He's very keen on engagement. He speaks to us. He's set up many sort of roundtable events. He is keen to hear our voice. And I think that he's not made up his mind about everything, which is right, but he consults. He genuinely consults. It's not a tick box exercise. He wants to know. He has a curiosity, and he doesn't assume he knows it all. So I have noticed a difference. And, I still have colleagues in the civil service, and they have noticed a difference. I think that lack of formality that he has allows people to relax, which means that they're more likely to speak their truth.
And to come back to your original desire for us to be more in our wise mind, I mean, how to do it? What are your tips?
So the tips, I guess, it's about knowing yourself, quite a lot of self-reflection, being able to practice things like mindfulness and, doing those kind of good, healthy things that you need to do as a human being to be aware of what is triggering you and what's setting you off and where's your chimp taking you, and being aware of all of those factors, but also engineering healthy habits in yourself. But taking time out, not just entering into the debate feet first and then sort of working out what you need to do.
Do you think you should be on social media? Which is obviously the thing that drives the most emotional responses at the moment.
Oh, well, social media is getting a massive kicking, and I think that, it's slightly scary, and I don't quite know where we stand on it. I think that we need it. because you need a platform and you need to be able to amplify your voice. And also when you're talking about not being in your echo chamber, you need to be able to reach out to people that wouldn't normally kind of listen to what you're saying. So I think it's important. But I don't know the answer to that yet. But what I do know is that what stops you from engaging with the process is not having any hope and becoming cynical. And so despite the challenges and despite the difficulties and the conflicts, you need to keep going on and fighting that fight around bringing hope and bringing reality and bringing an evidence-based and sensible debate into the whole discussion. Because if you then start dialing down your own voice because you've got fed up and negative and frustrated with it, then all those voices suddenly stop. And then you've got no voice, and then you've got no debate, you've got no one being in wise mind. So you've got to keep going, right?
Pia Sinha, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.